Silence is one of the most complex and paradoxical elements of human experience. It exists everywhere, surrounding speech, yet often goes unnoticed. Philosophers, writers, and spiritual teachers have reflected on its nature for centuries. Ludwig Wittgenstein, in the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, famously concluded that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent, suggesting that silence marks the boundary of language. Beyond language, there are mysteries, feelings, and truths that words cannot capture. Virginia Woolf, in the Lighthouse, depicts silence as a form of communication, a space where inner life is revealed. Herman Melville, in Moby-Dick, portrays silence as both cosmic and terrifying, a force that speaks more than words ever could. In religion and mysticism, silence is considered sacred. Buddhism uses silence as a path to transcend illusion and perceive ultimate reality. Christian monastic traditions prescribe silence to hear God's subtle voice, while Sufi mystics, including Rumi, describe silence as the language of the soul. Hinduism's practice of mauna, the discipline of silence, cultivates clarity and spiritual insight. Silence can be both comforting and challenging. It invites reflection and fosters awareness. Yet silence can also wound. The absence of speech may signify avoidance, fear, or oppression. Martin Luther King Jr. warned of the dangers of silent complicity in the face of injustice. Silence can be protective, yet it can also be suffocating or morally problematic. Literature shows this duality. Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale portrays enforced silence through fear, while Elie Wiesel's Night examines silence as societal failure. Philosophers, from Nietzsche to Kierkegaard, explore silence as strength, honesty, or contemplation. Silence is never merely nothing. It is a presence, a force, a witness to thought and feeling. In daily life, silence can be shared intimacy or profound isolation. It can teach, heal, wound, and inspire. It shapes identity, frames perception, and structures communication. In nature, silence is restorative and alive with subtle rhythms. Silence allows the human mind to encounter itself and the universe. It is the threshold where words fail, where presence speaks, and where life's ineffable dimensions are revealed. Reflection on silence deepens understanding of morality, creativity, and spirituality. To explore silence is to confront both our inner selves and the mysteries beyond speech. Silence often begins where words fail. Wittgenstein's famous insight reminds us that language, for all its complexity, cannot capture the totality of human experience. There are feelings too deep, mysteries too vast, and realities too subtle for words. Silence becomes the marker of this boundary, the invisible horizon of thought. Literary figures have captured this tension. T.S. Eliot, in Four Quartets, writes that the stillness, the dancing stillness, conveys truths beyond language, suggesting that silence itself can speak. James Joyce's Ulysses employs silence in its fragmented, experimental form, where what is unsaid is as powerful as what is written. These works remind us that silence is not emptiness, but a mode of expression. In philosophy, silence challenges the arrogance of words. We often assume that to name something is to know it, but silence humbles us. It shows that the deepest mysteries, consciousness, love, death, the divine, resist final articulation. Kierkegaard called silence a form of communication with God, where the ineffable is honored, not diminished. Silence also protects mystery. In sacred traditions, silence is not ignorance but reverence. The Torah, for example, suggests that the divine name cannot be fully spoken, leaving a sacred silence at the heart of worship. In Zen Buddhism, the teacher's silence is often the highest form of teaching, a wordless gesture pointing beyond intellect. At the personal level, we sense this boundary when we encounter grief or awe. In the presence of death, words falter. In the beauty of a sunset, language seems inadequate. In love, silence can carry the depth that words cannot reach. The silence at the limits of language is not failure. It is truth pressing beyond our symbols. Across religious and mystical traditions, silence is revered as the ultimate language of the divine. In Christianity, silence forms the backbone of monastic life. The rule of Saint Benedict prescribes silence to quiet the distractions of the world and hear God's still small voice. The mystic Meister Eckhart even suggested that silence is closer to God than words, for the divine transcends human speech. In Buddhism, silence is equally central. The Buddha himself often answered profound metaphysical questions, not with elaborate explanations, but with silence. A silence that indicated the futility of words in capturing ultimate reality. Zen koans often end in silence, forcing the seeker to move beyond thought into direct experience. In Islam, silence is tied to humility before God. Sufi mystics often speak of silence as the soul's deepest prayer. The poet Rumi reminds us, "Silence is the language of God, all else is poor translation." This suggests that silence itself is the truest form of devotion. Literary works echo this reverence. Thomas Merton's writings explore silence as a form of spiritual awakening. Rabindranath Tagore describes silence as a place where the soul meets eternity. In both, silence becomes the bridge between the finite and the infinite. But silence in religion is not merely absence, it is a space of fullness. In silence, the heart listens, the mind softens, and the divine mystery is allowed to emerge. Words attempt to capture God, but silence allows God to be present. This sacred silence reminds us that what cannot be spoken may still be deeply known. Not all silence is sacred or healing. At times, silence is weaponized. It can be a tool of control, suppression, or complicity. In the face of injustice, silence often protects the powerful and abandons the vulnerable. Martin Luther King Jr. famously declared, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." This silence is not noble but destructive. Literature illustrates this danger. In The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, silence is enforced through fear and violence, with women denied the right to speak freely. In Elie Wiesel's Night, silence in the face of atrocity becomes a haunting symbol of human failure, as the world turned away from suffering. These works show how silence, when imposed, can destroy dignity and truth. Philosophers also warn against this form of silence. Hannah Arendt wrote of the banality of evil, where ordinary people's refusal to speak or act allowed horrific crimes to unfold. Silence, in this sense, becomes collaboration with darkness. Religious traditions, too, acknowledge the danger of silence. The Hebrew prophets railed against those who stayed quiet in the face of injustice. In Buddhism, silence without compassion becomes empty, failing to embody the Bodhisattva's vow to aid all beings. In Christianity, the silence of Peter denying Christ is a moment of profound failure. This darker face of silence teaches us discernment. Silence can protect truth, but it can also obscure it. To remain silent in the face of suffering is not wisdom, but abandonment. True silence must be chosen freely, not imposed. It must honor life, not erase it. The challenge is to distinguish when silence is sacred and when it is complicit. In our daily lives, silence carries a complexity often overlooked. On one hand, silence can be peaceful, the quiet of a morning, the pause between conversations, the comfort of sitting with someone without needing words. On the other, silence can be awkward, tense, or suffocating, filling the air when communication breaks down. Philosophers suggest that this ambiguity reflects the human condition itself. Silence is both a refuge and a confrontation. It reveals intimacy when shared freely and distance when it replaces connection. To sit in silence with someone you trust is to feel at ease. To sit in silence with someone estranged is to feel the weight of absence. Literature captures this daily paradox. In Ernest Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants, silence between characters communicates more than their words. In Harold Pinter's plays, silence becomes a character itself, charged, unsettling, alive. These works remind us that silence is never empty. It always carries meaning. Psychology also emphasizes this duality. Therapists often use silence as a tool, allowing space for thoughts to emerge. Yet silence in families can be destructive, signaling avoidance rather than love. A child ignored in silence learns fear, not comfort. Religions recognize silence in daily life as a spiritual practice. Hindu traditions emphasize mauna, the discipline of silence, as a way to cultivate inner strength. Indigenous cultures often honor silence as respect for nature and community. Silence in everyday life teaches us awareness. It is not simply the absence of words, but a field of communication. Every pause, every quiet moment carries meaning. By learning to listen to silence, we uncover not emptiness, but a language deeper than speech. Literature demonstrates that silence can speak louder than words. Shakespeare often uses silence to signal grief, power, or reflection. In King Lear, Cordelia's refusal to speak flattery conveys integrity and love. Modernist writers like William Faulkner in The Sound and the Fury use gaps and fragmented narration to depict broken communication, making silence a haunting presence. Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot transforms pauses and silences into existential commentary on the uncertainty of human life. Poetry also celebrates silence. T.S. Eliot, Emily Dickinson, and Pablo Neruda utilize pauses, line breaks, and gaps to allow silence to resonate between words. Silence in poetry is not emptiness. It is rhythm, reflection, and heartbeat. Thomas Hardy often depicts unspoken emotion and isolation, showing how silence shapes human experience. Philosophically, literary silence intersects with ideas of truth and the limits of language. Wittgenstein argued that what cannot be spoken must be passed over in silence, a boundary that literature often explores. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche would see literary silence as a vehicle for existential and ethical reflection. Laozi would recognize it as harmony with deeper natural truths. Religious themes emerge in literature as well. John Milton in Paradise Lost portrays silence as a divine and cosmic presence. Rainer Maria Rilke's writings link silence with spiritual and creative awakening. Thomas Merton bridges literature and spirituality, showing silence as a path to deeper awareness. Silence in literature is never neutral. It conveys tension, intimacy, grief, and moral complexity. To read these pauses is to engage with the unspoken, the hidden, and the profound. By attending to silence, literature expands our understanding of human emotion, morality, and the ineffable. Philosophers have long explored silence as both boundary and insight. Wittgenstein famously concluded that whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Kierkegaard considered silence a higher honesty in matters of faith, where words fall short. Nietzsche emphasized silence as a form of strength, found in creation, endurance, and reflection. Laozi and the Taoist tradition celebrate quiet as harmony with the Tao, revealing truth without distortion. Heidegger viewed silence as essential to authentic listening, and Simone Weil connected silence to true attention and presence. Silence is a philosophical lens for understanding existence. Sartre and existentialists interpret the silence of the universe as an invitation to confront meaning without guarantees. Foucault examines silence socially, revealing power structures and the effects of what remains unspoken. Philosophers see silence not as absence but as saturated with significance, exposing the limits of reason and human perception. Literature intersects with philosophy here. Shakespeare, Faulkner, Beckett, and Milton explore the existential and moral weight of silence. Poetry, too, as by Rilke or Dickinson, allows silence to manifest as rhythm, reflection, and depth. Religious insights complement philosophy. Zen koans, Christian contemplation, and Sufi practice all embrace silence as transformative. Silence teaches reflection, moral discernment, and spiritual awareness. It invites humility, attention, and the recognition of mystery. Ultimately, philosophy sees silence as a space of thought, a canvas of the mind, and a portal to truths beyond articulation. Engaging with silence challenges intellect, ethics, and existence itself. Silence is never neutral in the context of power. Those in authority often regulate who may speak and who must remain silent. Michel Foucault analysed silence as a mechanism of control, showing that absence of voice reveals structures of power. In courts, classrooms, and governments, enforced silence maintains order and authority, yet silence can also become resistance. A refusal to speak, a vigil, or a silent protest can challenge domination. Literature illustrates this duality. In Toni Morrison's beloved, silences reveal historical trauma and resilience. In colonial contexts, silence preserved sacred traditions and cultural memory. Philosophically, silence exposes social dynamics. Arendt's work on the banality of evil highlights the dangers of passive silence. Nietzsche might see silence as power when it asserts dignity or withholds consent. Laozi would view strategic silence as alignment with natural flow rather than forced compliance. Silence signals who wields influence and who is marginalized. Religious teachings caution and guide regarding silence and power. Prophets speak against passive silence in the face of oppression. Buddhism emphasizes compassionate action over silence that enables harm. Christianity critiques silence that avoids moral responsibility. Silence then becomes both ethical and political. Silence as power is double-edged. It can oppress, liberate, protect, or resist. Understanding its dynamics requires awareness of context, intention, and consequence. Silence reveals the hidden architecture of authority and the potential for moral or political challenge. It can give voice to the voiceless while also silencing dissent. Learning to interpret silence is learning to navigate power, presence, and influence. Silence shapes identity as profoundly as speech. Who we are is reflected not only in our words but in what we choose not to say. Withheld confessions, quiet endurance of suffering, and pauses before forgiveness all reveal inner truth. Philosophers like Carl Jung suggest that silence shelters the shadow self, the aspects of our psyche that remain hidden and unarticulated. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche would see silence as a space for reflection, moral integrity, and self-determination. Literature often explores silence as identity. In Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, silence represents social invisibility and racial marginalization, where identity is denied recognition. Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior depicts silence as a vessel for cultural memory and generational tension. Toni Morrison demonstrates that silence can carry both trauma and resilience. Poetry, from Emily Dickinson to Rainer Maria Rilke, frames the unsaid as central to the human experience. Religious traditions highlight the formation of self through silence. Buddhist meditation teaches mindfulness and self-awareness in quiet reflection. Christian contemplative practices use silence for prayer, discernment, and communion with God. Sufi mysticism sees silence as a path to discover the soul's true nature. In each, silence allows deeper engagement with identity beyond external expectation. Silence can also be imposed, shaping identity through constraint. Societal, familial, or political pressures may force voices into shadows, limiting self-expression. Conversely, chosen silence fosters authenticity, reflection, and inner freedom. Daily life demonstrates this tension. Silence may bring comfort, but it may also mask fear or estrangement. Ultimately, silence is both refuge and prison. It can reveal the core of who we are, while also hiding aspects of ourselves. In meditation, literature, and philosophical reflection, silence becomes a tool to explore identity, selfhood, and moral presence. The question remains, who am I in the quiet spaces of my own being? When removed from human chatter, silence in nature has a profound presence. The hush of a forest, the stillness of snow, and the quiet of the desert reveal rhythms too subtle for words. Henry David Thoreau in Walden described nature's silence as a teacher, revealing harmony beneath human noise. John Muir observed that wilderness silence offers communion with life itself. Writers like Rilke and Tagore similarly celebrate natural silence as a source of reflection and spiritual insight. Religions interpret natural silence as sacred. Indigenous traditions teach that listening to the land honors creation and ancestral wisdom. Taoism sees natural quiet as alignment with the Tao, an expression of flow and balance. Buddhist and Christian contemplatives find in nature a place for meditation, prayer, and awareness of the divine. Philosophically, natural silence reminds us of human limitations. Heidegger saw silence as a way to encounter being beyond words, while Wittgenstein would acknowledge nature's unspoken truths as lying outside language. Silence in nature humbles, allowing observation and contemplation without imposing human interpretation. Psychology highlights the restorative benefits of natural silence. Exposure to quiet landscapes reduces stress, enhances creativity, and strengthens mental focus. In daily life, such silence is increasingly rare yet invaluable. It reconnects us to cycles, rhythms, and presence beyond societal distraction. Nature's silence is active, not empty. Birds, wind, and water produce subtle sounds that coexist with quiet, showing a depth beyond human speech. Sitting in this silence fosters awareness, wonder, and humility. By listening attentively, we realize that silence in nature is not absence. It is life speaking softly. Silence is most absolute in death. When life ceases, speech ends, and silence becomes total. Philosophers like Heidegger interpret death as the ultimate boundary, a confrontation with the unknown where words are powerless. Ancient Greek thinkers often considered death's silence as void, while religious traditions see it as passage to eternity or liberation. Christianity frames it as entrance into divine presence. Buddhism considers it the cessation of illusion. Sufism perceives death's silence as unity with the divine. Literature offers poignant depictions of death's silence. Emily Dickinson portrays silence as an inevitable companion to mortality. Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich shows the isolation and reflection that accompany dying. Shakespeare often uses silence to signify the end of life, the pause in human action, and the weight of mortality. Poetry, from Rilke to Tennyson, conveys death's quiet in lines that evoke reflection and mourning. Silence in mourning is equally powerful. Funerals, vigils, and moments of remembrance use silence to communicate grief, respect, and continuity. Psychologically, silence allows processing of loss, reflection on life, and presence with absence. Religious ritual amplifies this. The silent prayer, meditation, or vigil connects the living to the sacred. Philosophical reflection on death and silence encourages contemplation of the finite nature of life. It invites ethical living, mindfulness, and acceptance of impermanence. Death silence is both terrifying and revealing, a reminder that life is temporary and words are limited. Ultimately, silence at life's end teaches humility, reverence, and attention to what truly matters. Engaging with this silence allows the living to explore meaning, connection, and spiritual insight before the final pause. Despite its challenges, silence is a profound gift. It allows rest, introspection, and intimacy beyond words. Sitting in quiet with another can deepen relationships. Meditative silence brings awareness of the self and the divine. Literary voices celebrate this gift. Khalil Gibran describes silence as the companion of the soul, where wisdom is born. Rainer Maria Rilke frames silence as fertile ground for creativity and spiritual insight. Thomas Merton explores silence as a path to awakening and compassion. Philosophers agree on its significance. Heidegger emphasized silence as necessary for authentic listening. Simone Weil considered silence the purest form of attention, focusing on others, the divine, and life itself. Laozi and Buddhist thinkers see silence as a tool for alignment, insight, and presence in each moment. In daily life, silence allows for reflection, patience, and mindful action. Listening without interruption, pausing before response, and giving others space cultivates understanding. Silence communicates presence more powerfully than words in many contexts. Religious rituals reinforce this. Prayer, meditation, and contemplation honor the sacred through quiet. Nature's silence restores balance, creativity, and perspective. The gift of silence is the recognition that life is more than noise, speech, or explanation. It exists in pauses, reflective spaces, and quiet observation. Silence is not emptiness, it is presence, a canvas for insight, moral reflection, and deep connection. To embrace silence is to encounter life more fully, appreciating the unspoken dimensions of reality, identity, and spirit. Silence is a wellspring of creativity. Writers, poets, and artists often seek quiet to let ideas emerge fully. Emily Dickinson famously wrote in isolation, allowing silence to shape her verse. Rilke described solitude and silence as fertile ground for inner vision. Virginia Woolf, in A Room of One's Own, emphasized the need for uninterrupted space to cultivate imagination. Philosophers have also considered silence essential to thought. Kant and Schopenhauer believed that quiet reflection allows the mind to perceive truths that noise obscures. Laozi and Taoist thinkers saw silence as the conduit for intuitive insight, where thought aligns with the flow of life. Heidegger framed silence as necessary for authentic engagement with being, enabling understanding beyond mere words. Religious traditions integrate silence with inspiration. Buddhist meditation nurtures insight through contemplative quiet. Christian mystics, such as Thomas Merton, found in silence a source of spiritual clarity that also feeds creative expression. Sufi poetry often arises from periods of inner stillness, where silence channels divine inspiration. Psychology underscores that silence fosters originality. Reducing external noise allows the brain to explore ideas, make connections, and enter states of deep focus. In practice, silence is both method and medium. Writers, composers, and visual artists often need stillness to generate, shape, and refine their work. Ultimately, silence as creativity is active, not empty. It is a space where imagination meets reflection, where insight blooms, and where the unseen and unsaid find form. To embrace silence is to cultivate the potential for invention, artistry, and the deep interplay between thought and intuition. Silence is an essential part of communication. It conveys meaning as powerfully as words. In dialogue, a pause can signal respect, contemplation, tension, or dissent. Literature captures this subtly. In Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants, the pauses between characters carry more significance than dialogue, revealing emotional depth. Pinter's plays use silence as a character itself, charged with tension, subtext, and unspoken conflict. Philosophers explore silence as communication beyond speech. Wittgenstein suggests that the limits of language define where silence must take over. Kierkegaard frames silence as a higher form of ethical and spiritual communication, where the ineffable truth is honored. Heidegger emphasizes listening in silence as essential to genuine understanding, suggesting that meaning often arises in what is unspoken. Religious practices reflect this principle. Buddhist monks communicate teachings through quiet example and contemplative presence. Quaker worship relies on communal silence to enable spiritual insight and shared understanding. In Christian monasticism, silence fosters attentiveness, creating space for the divine to be encountered. In daily life, silence functions in myriad ways. It may soothe, heighten empathy, or allow reflection. Alternatively, it can create discomfort, miscommunication, or alienation. Active listening requires silence, pausing before speaking, observing body language, and attending to nuance. Silence in communication is a tool for presence, connection, and understanding. Understanding silence in communication teaches us that words are only part of interaction. The unspoken, the pause, the gaze, or the quiet gesture carries layers of meaning. By mastering the art of silence, we engage more fully with others, fostering trust, empathy, and depth in relationships. To better understand silence, several literary and philosophical works offer profound insight. In literature, Emily Dickinson's Selected Poems explores the unspoken through pauses and imagery, capturing silence as both presence and absence. Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own delves into the inner silences of thought and creativity, showing how reflection emerges from quiet moments. Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man examines the silence imposed by society, revealing the ways identity is shaped by what remains unspoken. Toni Morrison's Beloved portrays silence as both trauma and resistance, giving voice to what cannot be fully articulated. Ernest Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants demonstrates how tension and emotion are carried in the spaces between words. Rainer Maria Rilke, in Letters to a Young Poet, writes about the fertile inner silence, where creativity and self-understanding grow. Harold Pinter's plays, such as The Birthday Party, use silence as an active force, conveying anxiety, power, and ambiguity. Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior shows how silence bridges generations and cultural memory. Philosophy also offers essential perspectives. Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus identifies silence as the boundary of what can be meaningfully said. Søren Kierkegaard, in Fear and Trembling, emphasizes silence as the space where faith confronts the ineffable. Martin Heidegger, in Being and Time, explores silence as a mode of authentic being, where reflection transcends idle chatter. Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra portrays silence as strength and self-mastery. Laozi's Tao Te Ching in Taoist philosophy illustrates the power of unspoken harmony with the flow of existence. Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason indirectly invites contemplation of the limits of reason, a space where silence becomes a teacher. Arthur Schopenhauer, in The World as Will and Representation, reveals the deep philosophical resonance of quiet reflection and the unarticulated dimensions of human experience. Engaging with these works allows us to encounter silence in its many forms: contemplative, oppressive, liberating, and creative. Each title deepens our appreciation of how what is left unsaid can speak more profoundly than any words, linking literature, philosophy, and life itself in a shared meditation on the unspoken. Silence is not merely the absence of words, it is an active presence, a space for reflection, creativity, spirituality, and understanding. Throughout literature, philosophy, and religion, silence emerges as a source of insight, identity, and power. Writers from Emily Dickinson to Toni Morrison show that what is unsaid often carries the deepest truths. Philosophers from Wittgenstein to Heidegger highlight silence as essential for comprehension and ethical reflection. Religious traditions from Buddhism to Christianity emphasize silence as a path to the divine. In daily life, silence is both refuge and challenge. It fosters intimacy, encourages mindfulness, and allows for ethical discernment. Yet silence can also be oppressive or misunderstood. Understanding when to embrace silence and when to break it is a profound skill, shaping communication, identity, and moral engagement. Natural silence reminds us of our place in the broader world. Forests, deserts, oceans, and skies speak quietly yet profoundly, calling attention to rhythms beyond human language. Death's silence confronts us with impermanence, guiding reflection on what truly matters. Silence in creativity allows the unseen to emerge and imagination to flourish. Silence in communication enables listening, presence, and empathy. Ultimately, to embrace silence is to recognize the unseen and unspoken dimensions of life. It challenges us to explore what cannot be said, to honor what is hidden, and to cultivate depth in thought, emotion, and spirit. Silence is both a teacher and companion, revealing meaning in absence, presence in quiet, and truth in what is left unsaid. By engaging fully with silence, we open ourselves to understanding, creativity, and the sacred dimensions of existence.